Daniel, thanks so much for coming here on the episode to talk about, the exciting things that you guys are doing. Talk a little bit about your founder journey and your innovation of Tabiat.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And this has been a long time. It's been a long journey for us. This started off as my PhD research, and initially I was really interested in using AI and wearables. So smartwatches were brand new on the market at the time,
Okay.
and I had initially played around with them. So I built one of the first apps where you could like move your phone around, and it would control the cursor on your screen. So that was like an undergrad project, and that was like early days of
All right.
smartphones.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, I want to do
I'm dealing
something.
with a whole higher intellect than me, that you could do that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So it was fun. I gave my presentation for that project, and I'm like, well, I've been using it this whole presentation. Um,
That's awesome.
so I knew I wanted to do things like that because technology has so many potentials that you don't even think of. But then I also realized that there's going to be at least 5 years that I'm going to be dedicating to a project. So I want it to be more meaningful. And so I started thinking, how else can we use these sensors? And healthcare sort of stood out as a way because huge impact. It can help a lot of people as well. And then we started looking in the healthcare space. We came across doctors that were interested in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is COPD, which is what we're focused on now. um, and we realized that a lot of the symptoms that patients have we can measure with sensors that are already on devices. So smartwatches, brand new. I'm like, these have motion sensors, they have microphones. We can pick up things like coughing and wheezing and how much people are walking. So
Mm.
all of that stuff should be some sort of indication as to how their COPD is. And so that was really the start of a very long journey.
Wow. And so tell me where Tabiat is today, based upon that vision. Where are you guys on your journey as far as this innovation?
So that's also been it's so in some ways it's developed a lot, in some ways it's stayed the same.
Okay.
This grand idea of wearables and sensors being able to use to passively sense what's going on with a patient and being able to use that to predict how patients will change in the future, that has stayed constant. But what's really interesting, especially about the healthcare space, is innovation has to come at sort of a very specific pace.
Hmm.
So this is not really an idea that we can go out and sell to healthcare today. And there's a lot of red tape, requirements, regulatory, which is all there for good reason. So we're working within those bounds as well. So we've taken that core idea and we've figured out what is a service offering that we can offer to healthcare systems today that would benefit them today, and it's incrementally innovative, but is enough to get us the data we need to actually build that futuristic system that we started off envisioning.
Got it. So you guys are taking somewhat of an incremental approach towards that master vision. So where's the model at today as part of that march?
So it's already we have a cough detection model that's been validated on COPD patients.
Wow.
This is published literature. It's been a couple years now, but it was state of the art, and it's one of the only few models out there that have been validated in a real world setting. So if you think about a patient is going about their day, you're going to be collecting so many different types of sensor data, and it becomes a huge problem because it really is like even with a COPD patient, finding a cough is almost like finding a needle in a haystack. Just when you think about
Really?
all the other sounds that are out there in that
True.
world.
True.
So that's what the models are really focused on, and that's what a lot of previous literature had missed. Because you can collect data in a lab and you can detect cough when there's no other sounds going on, but doing that when the TV that might be playing and there's somebody coughing in there. Um, so we have state of the art cough detection. We have respiratory rate detection from a smartwatch that's patent pending currently.
Wow.
And then we've started doing some initial work on using speech markers as well. So
Okay.
if you think about lung disease, somebody's having a hard time breathing, the amount that they're speaking, the pauses that they're taking between words, all of those things are indicative of what's going on with their lung health. So we're trying to gather those types of markers as well. And then the ultimate goal is to use those to predict, based on data we're collecting today, how they're going to be, let's say, 2 days out, and are they going to require hospitalization 2 days in the future? And so we have some initial validation that that type of model works as well. It's not something that's on a scale that I would say we can deploy it in a clinic today, but that's the whole goal of this program that we're presenting as part of this program is it's giving us the data that we need to validate that model and then in the future bring it into informed clinical decision making.
Now, are you guys using machine learning? I mean, how are you through these models creating these models that you're validating? What does that process look like?
That is years of sweat and tears.
Yeah, I
Um,
bet.
so that's my PhD was on using machine learning for this exact problem. I studied at the University of Toronto. That's where a lot of this machine learning, artificial intelligence innovation's been coming out. So one of the the sort of leaders in the field, Professor Jeffrey Hinton, was a professor here. He taught the machine learning course this semester before I took it. But he won the Nobel Prize the other week in physics for his contributions to the machine learning field. So
Wow.
that's been a huge, lots of events going on in Toronto right now because of that. But
Right.
yes, we're building application specific machine learning models, but we've also built our own architectures because this is a fairly novel sort of environment that we're running machine learning in.
Right.
And so we collect a lot of data ourselves because again, it's very specific patient population, specific types of data that we need. So we collect that data, we build our own models, and then we validate that the models actually work on this patient population. But that takes a year at the pace that we were doing research at.
Yeah, it's interesting from a technology standpoint. People just assume that, what is it, Ohm's law or whatever it is that, from there. But with healthcare and when you're dealing with people, while you have technology, you're not going to get the same curve. I do believe that there is a point of exponential once you get widespread adoption for these type of things, but that's a long tail. It's almost like a drug, like a drug, a pharma type invention. The only difference is you're not going to have as much cost in human stuff, but the time element of that and the adoption rate to be able to get that are very, very similar. Would you agree?
Yeah. And I think there is going to come sort of an inflection point on the adoption side.
Okay.
The and I go back and forth on this as well because we can do a lot of things. Like for me to spin up a large language model and start feeding it in a bunch of clinical data and like it'll give me a result,
Hmm.
right? But is that result actually going to be relevant?
Right.
And is it something that the doctor should be using? That's a much harder question to answer. And so we have sort of frameworks to measure how well a system is performing, but then you run into all sorts of new problems as well as you get drift. I'm sure you've heard like, there's so much
Mhm.
content that Chat GPT was trained on the internet. Now there's so much content on the internet that was generated by Chat GPT. So what are new versions of Chat GPT actually learning?
Right. They're echoing themselves
Yeah.
and then, mirroring them. And,
Yeah.
one of the things, and I tell this to people a lot, like on the law side, which is, complexity, a lot less complex.
Mhm.
We've, put stuff into Chat GPT. I've had clients put stuff in Chat GPT and it'll give you something that you're like, oh, okay, that looks it. But then when you look at the substance behind it, it's not right. And so, what's the error in the legal world is I've got unenforceable or I look like a moron, one of the two, right? In the clinical setting, I mean, that's life, death, quality of life, those sort of things that,
Mhm.
again, that takes the time to have the right data sets because drift can be dangerous,
Yeah.
in a major way that way.
And I mean, there's an element of drift, and there's when we're talking about the scale that we typically talk about with technology platforms, there are a lot of things that you can just sort of move past, and
Mhm.
there's assumptions underneath, but you don't really need to know them. I'll give
Right.
you a really good example. Is you might know that a lot of smartwatches have a heart rate sensor on them.
Right.
So about 9, 10 years ago, when I first started playing around with smartwatches, I was just testing a smartwatch because we were getting like weird data points from the heart rate sensor. And I had my smartwatch sitting on the table and I was trying to look at data streams and it was reporting a heart rate while sitting on a table, not on a wrist.
Oh yeah.
So the way that the algorithms work even inside those devices, and like if we were to use this as the foundation for a machine learning model, then like what is it that we're training the model on? So when it
Right.
comes to a matter of life and death in a healthcare application setting, then you have to evaluate all of those pieces really closely. And so we knew about this for a long time. We had algorithms built in to figure out a little bit more cleverly what's actually going on. And then last year, I saw an article on a major news outlet because somebody had put a smartwatch on a banana, and the banana had a heart rate of like 60 beats per minute. So that went viral about a year ago.
As somebody that lives and dies with their heart rate and trying to lower that, I may be fighting a losing battle here. Just my own watch is fighting me. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's
Well, let me ask you this, because congratulations about being a part of the Methodist Healthcare Ministries and Velocity Health Community Health Accelerator. You've already talked about how you're in Toronto. Why did you guys decide that it was, why did you apply to the accelerator? Why did y'all engage in the accelerator based upon what y'all are trying to achieve?
So one of the things that really stood out as unique was this opportunity to pilot with Methodist Healthcare Ministries. And from our perspective, one of the really challenging aspects of this business is trying to get healthcare sales.
Right.
So the sales process is really challenging, especially when we're talking about hospitals that have very large organizational structures. We're trying to figure out who is the pulmonologist, who is, the chief of pulmonology, who's going to be their boss, and then their boss's boss, and we're trying to
Right.
navigate this whole sort of organization and figure out what is it that everybody cares about and how we can sort of make sure that our solution is actually tailored to what they need. So the way that this accelerator program is structured, where you have a healthcare partner that has a very specific problem, Velocity helped us navigate sort of who are the people that are involved in this, what is it that they're focused on. Um, even basic things like MHM's transition to focusing on social determinants of health and trying to address healthcare issues before they become healthcare issues,
Right.
like that is something that the organization cares about, and if we were coming in as an outsider, it would take us a long time to figure that out. But Velocity being able to connect us with the right people and say, here are the people that are focusing on this area, this is what they do on a day-to-day basis, this is what they care about,
Right.
helped us sort of define our program. It's a very quick way into that organization.
No, that makes complete sense for that. And I mean, these accelerators and including the community health accelerator, take a whole lot of time. So tell me, if you guys were to get the pilot, what would that mean for what y'all are doing on your journey? How does that pilot, what would that do for y'all as a company?
That would be huge. So we've been exploring sort of deploying our program all over the states. We do have a couple hospitals in the pipeline, but those sales cycles take forever.
Right.
So getting a commitment from MHM to say we're going to, roll out your program across a few counties, and then we're interested in expanding them to all counties as well down the road. That would be a very quick way in and get us some of that initial validation about how our program is working, because we've built this thing, we've tested it in Canada, we're now transitioning it to the US. We know there are things that are going to go wrong, but that's what we're focused on figuring out and making sure that we can build this in the long term to be sustainable and useful. So having a partner who's committed to helping us do that is huge.
So, and you talk about pilots and validations in Canada. You do have several pilots and other collaborations that y'all have done. Talk about that process and how you were able to engage those pilots and what it did for your company.
Yeah, those were also really interesting. It's not. It may or may not be sort of like the typical journey, but because we started off as research,
Right.
we did start off with research grants to do a lot of this work. So we got some research grants. We ran an initial pilot, had a lot of learnings. Primarily, the learning was that elderly patients who have COPD are not very keen on using a mobile app.
Okay.
So,
That makes
which is,
sense.
it makes sense. It's something that it's a reality. But then we went back, we did another version where we tried to focus on what are the reasons that people didn't like using the app, what are ways that we can make the app more valuable for them. And there's like lots of tiny little things. Like somebody once said that before going out to get groceries, I have to check air quality index, because if the air quality is bad, I'm not going to go out today and I might go out tomorrow instead.
Mm,
So building that into the app is just saving them sort of, it saved them a trip to their computer, and like now you don't have to, go Google or check the weather report. You can just see it in
right.
the app here.
So that way you're adding value to there. So that way you're creating that stickiness. That makes sense.
Exactly. And so by the time we got to our second pilot, again, these are like Canadian government funded
Sure.
pilots that we had. Um, we had about 93% adherence over a 6 month period.
Wow.
We were also lucky enough that during this time, I worked with Samsung Research in Mountain View and their digital health lab. So I was also working specifically on COPD. We did a bunch of work together there. They liked the research area so much that they actually funded one of our next programs. So they
Mm,
provided devices. We collected a lot of data with Samsung smartwatches. We ran a much bigger study, and then probably actually the largest pilot that we had was during COVID. So even though we had a COPD program, most of that program got shut down during
sure.
COVID because at times we would bring patients into the hospital and run sort of like experiments. But bringing high risk patients into the hospital during COVID was just a no go.
Right.
But we ended up transitioning our program to help COVID at the time.
Mm,
So the workflow at the time was, somebody would come in, they would get a COVID test. If it comes back positive, but the patient isn't super sick, they would get sent home to recover.
okay.
So now that the patient is at home recovering, the doctor still needs to check in on them to see how they're doing. And the current workflow was that the doctor would sit on the phone all day and call hundreds of patients and just see that they're okay.
Right.
So we said you can use our dashboard to do exactly that. Instead of you having to receive data, or instead of you having to call to get that data, you get the data uploaded to a dashboard, and you can see these are the patients that are having symptoms and I should call. So
Wow.
that sort of changed the workflow completely for a lot of the doctors.
Sure.
And because we had a lot of experience in the space, we were actually able to get that first hospital up and running within about a month and a half.
Oh, wow.
So we got four more hospitals after that. But that gave us a lot of insight into the clinical workflow. So I would work very directly with the doctors and the nurses that were using the program on a day-to-day basis. And what are their workflows? What do they want to see? What do they care about? And making sure that all of the workflows within the dashboard suit them rather than just create more work for them.
Well, and then I think I know your model, but your model is not just a monitoring model, but you've got intervention capability as well, correct?
Yeah, to a limited extent. That's something that
Okay.
we want to build out more so in the future. We've got a lot of ideas about how we can make this much more comprehensive. But yes, monitoring. One of the downsides. I mean, technically, we're using remote patient monitoring codes,
Right.
but we've built a much more comprehensive program on top of that with very defined sort of goals and endpoints. But one of the downsides with monitoring is somebody has to be there to monitor the data, and
Right.
most clinicians don't have the time to do that. So we do
Correct.
have our own nursing team in between who will sort of review any data that comes in, and then it's up to the discretion of the nurse to decide if this is a case that should be escalated back to the provider, and then the provider has the ability to deal with that case however they deem fit.
Which, again, I think during COVID, because you brought that up, right? We had this, we'll just talk to a doc via the phone
Mhm.
that kind of hit its peak. It's come down. And I think we're going to find a nice blend of that between interventions and technology, because technology alone, I think the adoption rate and what do I do with this data? My heart rate says it's elevated. Well, what does that mean? But the technology that allows for better self diagnosis, self understanding with some intervention, those will probably be the future that we're going to see a lot in technology. Do you see that as the future?
Absolutely. One of the things that we often talk about, both in our sales and our investor pitch, is we're trying to put the human element first,
Hmm.
right? And what I mean by that is there's a lot of technology companies, like if you're talking about your product, you can talk about, we integrate with 100 different devices and we integrate with EHR systems and we have all of these data points and we can do all of this. But at the end of the day, if it's not benefiting people, so the
Right.
providers that are dealing with patients and the patients themselves, there's not much reason to use it. And this technology fundamentally has a lot of capabilities. There's so many people living in rural areas. I think with COPD, in some rural areas, it's as many as one pulmonologist per 6,000
Oh, wow.
patients.
Wow.
So people do have to travel really far to go to their pulmonologist. And some people have to travel quite a distance to get to emergency care.
Right.
So being able to sort of bridge those gaps and help people figure out, you're sick enough that this is worth going to your doctor now, or you are getting worse, but you do have emergency medication. You should continue taking that, and maybe you can self-manage at home. But if you get to this point, then you really should go. So helping people figure out things like that is, it's small. It's not really. There isn't technology-enabled element of it, but it's what is the benefit to the patient, and I think that's what's going to drive the adoption of the technology.
No, I agree. I mean, in healthcare and in being in hospitals, your ERs get flooded with worry,
Yep.
along with, real. And sometimes you get flooded so much, you have to treat every patient as though it's real, even though it's a worry. And many of those can be avoided just with better knowledge and information. So I think what you guys are doing is great. So Danny, let me ask you, this podcast, we're here in South Texas, and we have a lot of companies with a lot. What from a founder standpoint has been the greatest surprise for you through this journey that maybe you didn't anticipate when you set off on it?
That's an interesting question. Um, I probably have. Actually, probably all founders have. It feels like 90% of things are surprises. Um,
That's fair.
because so for myself specifically, I came from a technical and then research background. So
Right.
the technology stuff I'm comfortable with, and I'm always eager. Like I want to get back into coding, but it's probably been a few years since I've coded anything.
Okay.
Mostly because I've been working on the business side.
Got it.
So developing um, developing that sort of storytelling that's needed for business, I think that's probably the biggest thing that I had to learn. Because from a research perspective, a lot of what we're doing is like fact, 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 fact,
Right. Very
and then
concrete and black and white.
yeah. So there's no storytelling there. It's like here are the
Right.
facts, and then this is what somebody could conclude. Um, Whereas it has to be a lot more colorful. Obviously, in the healthcare space, we can't move away from any of the science or make claims that aren't reasonable. But we do have to find a way because we're selling to people, I'm pitching to people, and people get interested in stories. So the storytelling element is huge.
There's a great episode we have with a great storyteller here, and I agree. You think from things, whether it's a business mindset, a technical mindset, but when the audience becomes around pitches and getting somebody to connect with your innovation and to buy in, the storytelling aspect is a challenge for a whole lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Daniel, I can't thank you enough for one, being a part of the accelerator. I mean, all the way from Toronto. Again, when we came with this vision of the Methodist Healthcare Ministries Velocity Accelerator, we wanted to find local, we wanted to find domestic, we find international innovations that had the potential to impact our community. And I think that there is a lot of ways that we're going to still see you guys impacting our community. And I wanted to thank you for making that journey and coming down and being a part of all of that.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be down there. The Texas hospitality is very real. Um,
It
a
is.
very friendly people. Everybody was offering, I can just drop you off at the hotel. I can drop you off here if you want to go there. We met random folks who told us we need to do the river walk. We need to go down to the Pearl. Like everybody had friendly suggestions, and it was a lot of fun being down there.
Well, good. Well, thanks so much again for coming on this episode, and I can't wait to talk to you down the road.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and likewise.